let's talk about the relations between India and the Arab world. More specifically, I'll be talking about Kuwait, UAE and Saudi Arabia as we go along, right? Achha, in 1950s, as you know, this is, if you recall, we did talk about the fact that Maulana Azad was responsible for influencing Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's policy, foreign policy towards Israel also. He naturally said that, Israel is not that important to us. It wasn't in those days. North, of course, it's one of the principal pillars of a relationship in the region, right? So he understood the fact that, Pakistan is trying to bring the Arabic countries to its side, and if we today join hands with Israel, then what will happen is that all the Arab countries would rally behind Pakistan, and that would make things difficult for us in our own neighborhood also, right? So, so Pakistan was a big factor that prevented us from normalizing ties. Even though we recognize Israel, Pakistan was a major factor which prevented us from normalizing ties with Israel, right? But Pakistan still tried to rally the Muslim nations, the Arab nations behind them. But the good thing is that, in the 1950s, the ties between India and most of the Arab world, they were cordial and warm relations. I mean, two factors basically explain this. In spite of the Pakistani factor being at play, but yet our relations with the Arabian world, with the Arab world, they were cordial, they were warm. Many of them were members of NAM movement also, right? Achha, the reasons, how do we explain the fact that in spite of the Pakistani factor in the 1950s, we had cordial and warm relations with the Arab world? One is they were very appreciative of India's very strong policy against colonialism. Right, after 1950s, we became decolonized, but many of the other countries of the world were not yet decolonized. So we had a great support towards all such anti-colonial struggles. And the other thing that resonated very positively and created a lot of goodwill in the Arab world for India was India's staunch support for the Palestinian cause, right? So these two factors were responsible for the fact that India had a very strong anti-colonial posture. Then we had a very staunch support for the Palestinian cause also. So these two things resonated very well and created considerable goodwill for India in the Arab world, right? But then some developments took place in 1960s and 70s. Although these developments immediately did not harm India, but we saw that due to these developments, the basic polarities in the West Asia region were now going to be shaped. Now see what happened. 1960s, let us take this one first, 1960s. 1967 may we have the Arab-Israel war. We talked about this war in which the Israelis occupied those territories of Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, etc. Right. So after the defeat of Egypt and Jordan at the hand of Israel in this 6-day war, 1967 Arab-Israel war, now Saudi Arabia in particular and the Arab world in general, they felt that if they stand divided, so then countries like Israel can practically overrun them, right? So it is during this time that Saudi Arabia started floating the idea of pan-Islamic solidarity. All nations of all Islamic nations, they form one compact unit, so that if they form one compact unit, one compact organization and coordinate their policies, then they can acquire a lot of influence in global politics, right? So after the defeat of Egypt in 1967 in the Arab and Jordan, of course, and the Arab-Israel war, Saudi Arabia floated the idea of pan-Islamic solidarity, okay, and also known as Islamic or, just a moment, Muslim Ummah. Ummah means community. So all the countries which are Islamic in nature, which have majority Muslim population, they should come together and form a compact Muslim community, and collectively they can actually drive hard bargains with the more powerful players of the world. They would acquire greater influence on global politics, right? And when they started promoting pan-Islamic solidarity and bringing together all the Islamic countries of the world under one umbrella, so then some organization had to be set up. So it is no surprise, no coincidence that by late 1960s, 1969, we find the creation of, the steps were taken to create a body called the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which has more than 50 Muslim countries as a part over here. Acha, this I've talked about this earlier also, but just to recapitulate, Organization of Islamic Cooperation was earlier called the Organization of Islamic Conference, right? So now it's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, right? So you can see developments taking place in the 60s because of the Arab-Israel war. Then in 1979, we talked about this earlier, we had the Islamic Revolution where? In Iran. and Iran, who was an ally earlier of US and thereby the ally of Israel also, but now Iran has gone, the Shah of Iran was deposed, Islamic revolution takes place, Islamic rule comes in Iran. Now the Arab states started feeling the heat of the threat perception from Iran also. Therefore it is not surprising that there is not even a coincidence over here. 1979, the Islamic revolution takes place. American ally becomes America's biggest adversary in the West Asia region. And just in the 2 years after this revolution, in 1981, the GCC is formed. So it's not a coincidence that GCC was formed in 1981, very close to the Islamic Revolution, because after the Islamic Revolution, America lost its one of its prominent allies in the region. It became an adversary, right? And America still continued to be an ally of the Arab world, feeling the threat perception from Iran, and that is why within a period of 2 years they also formed the 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council, right? But in the 1980s and 1990s, our relations, political relations, so to speak, went down a little. Why? With the Arab world. If you look at 1980s, now see here, Afghanistan under Soviet occupation, correct? US, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and several other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, being the informal leader of the Arabic world, and most countries, even in those days, now to a lesser extent, that is, in those days used to take their guidance, used to take their cues, foreign policy cues from Saudi Arabia, right? So USA, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, they supported the jihadi movement against Soviet occupation. While we were not very happy with that, because in the 1980s we were more or less inclined towards the Soviets, so we stood on different sides, on the opposite sides exactly. We have countries of the Arab world, particularly the leading country Saudi Arabia, along with Pakistan and United States, now supporting a jihadi struggle against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which eventually ended in 1989, right? But we could not support it because we were inclined more towards Soviet Union, right? Then after the end of Soviet occupation over here, in the 1990s came the Taliban regime. So Taliban was also supported by US and Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, but countries like India, Iran and Soviet Union in those days, and Russia in those days, we supported something called, go back to my lectures on India-Afghan relations, you will probably be able to relate it to Northern Alliance. So they supported the Taliban, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and the Arab world supporting Taliban over here in the 1990s. But after because when Taliban was there was another alliance formed to contest, to continue the military contestation with Taliban. India, Iran, Russia, in those days, we all supported the Northern Alliance. So you can see that political relations deteriorated in 1980s because of the support given by the Arab world, Pakistan, USA to the anti-Soviet struggle in Afghanistan, and then post the struggle, the fact that Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, other Arab world supported Taliban while we supported the Northern Alliance, right? But interesting thing is this, that even though your political relations were going down, but our economic ties were still flourishing, right? We still continue to purchase oil and gas from them. This is a replay of history which is taking place now. Even though look at the political contestation which is going on between Russia and Europe and America today because of Ukraine war, but they are still purchasing oil and gas from them. So something, although of course not exactly the same kind of scenario, we were not involved in a war, or they were not involved in a war, but then of course something very similar scenario was being played out in those days also. Acha, now, because of this tremendous oil wealth that now is in the possession of the rulers in the Arab world, back in those days itself, back in 80s, 90s, with the huge dollar reserves that they had, they embarked upon, most of the Arabian states, they embarked upon very massive national economic development programs, infrastructure development programs, for which they required a lot of blue collar workers. And since then, India has indeed become the primary source of blue collar workers for construction jobs, for infrastructure development activities, etc. So India became a major source for that. That's how you explain 8 million strong Indian diaspora in the region, right? So you can see that even though your political ties were somewhat riddled with tensions because of the reasons I explained, yet our economic ties, they flourished. People to people contacts also flourished. A huge part of Indian diaspora became the supplier of cheap labor to Arabic have been to Arab countries who had embarked on using their massive dollar reserves, who had embarked upon massive infrastructure and economic development programs for which they required cheap labor, skilled, semi-skilled, etc. And then actually the blue collar workers, and for which India became a principal source of providing that cheap blue collar workers. Right. Actually, the interesting thing is in 1990. The ratio of, because India, it's not that only people who do semi-skilled and skilled jobs or simply manual jobs in Arab countries, and only these people who go from India to Arab countries. But yes, majority of the workers are still blue collar, less are white collar. But look at the ratio. In 1990, this ratio was 90:10. So 90 blue collar, 10 white collar job, more professional jobs, so to speak, like doctors, engineers, etc. So the ratio was 90% to 10%. 90:10, 90% blue collar workers and your 10% white collar workers, right? But the interesting thing is that this ratio over the last decade or so has transformed into 70-30. So today you can see that a large number of professionals, the number of professionals who are going to Arab world as engineers, doctors, etc., they have increased tremendously, and that ratio which actually stood at 90:10 blue collar versus white collar has now transformed into something like 70-30. So we are also becoming an important source of not just blue collar workers, but also an important source of providing professionals, engineers, doctors, other experts, accountants, etc., etc. Correct. So Indian workers in the Gulf, as I said, that even though political relations were going down, yet our economic ties flourished primarily because of hydrocarbon trade and the fact that they had embarked upon those development programs for which they required cheap Indian labor, and India became they required cheap labor. India became the principal source of providing blue collar workers, right? But after 2000, especially after 2001, 9/11, the whole dynamics of the region changed completely. And you can see that post 2000, there has been a major transformation in India's relationship with the Arab world, in particular with two prominent countries, that is Saudi Arabia and UAE. I'll talk about that transformation as I come to the specific topic of India's relation with Saudi Arabia and UAE. Right. So post 2000, and the interesting thing is that post 2000, Pakistan's relevance in Pakistan's potential to do things which can lead to some deterioration in relations between India and the Arab world, they have also come down somewhat. During the 80s, 90s, one more irritant was there. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation was set up, and routinely we found that under the influence of Pakistan, the OIC would regularly pass resolutions against treatment of Muslim minorities in India, against what India is doing in Kashmir. But now OIC has become more considerate about Indian concerns. But when these things used to happen in 1990s also, so for some time to India used to react sharply. But over time India felt that Pakistan says something to them, they are influenced by it, they just adopt a resolution, it's become a routine affair, and after some time India stopped bothering about those OIC resolutions. But that was indeed also a smaller source of tension in the 80s and 90s between India and the Arab world. Right. But post 2000, there has been a major transformation in the relationship. We'll talk about it as we go along.